Excellent. Okay, so hello everyone again. We last time we were looking at the halachos of Tzedaka, and I wanted to shift today and for another couple of weeks to look at the halachos of Maa'ser. Now, just to remind you, even though there's obviously a link between the mitzvah of Tzedaka and the mitzvah of Maa'ser, they're not the same thing. They're not identical. So what we learned over the last few weeks was, or before the break, was the mitzvah of Tzedaka. And the mitzvah of Tzedaka is on everyone. Every Jew ought to give some money to people in need, and that's the mitzvah of Tzedaka. Now, there's no set or defined quantity for Tzedaka, and Tzedaka, the mitzvah of Tzedaka, is triggered by the need. It's need-based. So if someone approaches me and says they need money, I have an obligation to give them. I shouldn't turn anyone away who needs. You remember we looked at the psukim, don't harden your heart, don't clench your fist, right? A person should tithing, one should surely give. If someone approaches you for money, that's the mitzvah of Tzedaka. If no one ever approaches you for money, you don't have that mitzvah of Tzedaka. You don't have to go and seek people out. There's no specific amount that's set aside for that. That's the mitzvah of Tzedaka. And we discussed the priorities of tzedakah giving, and when there's several competing needs that are appealing for the same funds. Charity starts at home, close relatives, those who live in one city, and that's what we learned about the halachos of tzedakah. Maa'ser is conceptually a very different thing, because Maa'ser says proactively go and tithe. So set aside a particular sum and quantity of money, a tenth of one's income, and actively make sure that one gives it to tzedakah. So if you tithe Maa'ser money, now one has to make sure that one goes and spends that money and finds deserving causes for it. Otherwise, the money is just sitting in one's account. This is the halacha of Maa'ser. So to summarize, tzedakah is without specific calculation. Maa'ser is very detailed, a specific calculation. With tzedakah, one only gives it with an oni, with a poor person, lefanecha. Whereas Maa'ser, one has to look to distribute the sums of money. So this is the second distinction. In addition, Maa'ser has a unique quality to it, in which Chazal describe someone who gives Maa'ser as if one is a partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in one's business, in one's affairs, in one's work. Because with tzedakah, all you're saying is, I've got my money, and I will choose to be generous and give some of my money to tzedakah. With Maa'ser, what one's really saying is Hashem is a shutuf, a partner in my affairs. He's a 10% partner, as it were. There's a relationship between us. If we look in Chazal, it's difficult to know what to make of this exactly, but Chazal say that someone who gives tzedakah won't become impoverished, where someone who gives Maa'ser will become enriched. Now, whether that means literally or metaphorically speaking and so on, I don't know, but that's the difference in the language that's used. So these are the four differences between Maa'ser and tzedakah. That Maa'ser is that tzedakah is only when there's a need in front of you. Tzedakah is not an exact calculation. Maa'ser, Hashem becomes a partner, and Maa'ser, there's a unique haftacha or promise that one will be enriched by giving Maa'ser. So this is the introduction to what we're learning now. We're learning the halachas of Maa'ser. So where does the obligation to give Maa'ser come from? So there is a midrashic source, Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, that and a Tosfos that believes that this is a Torah obligation. When you learn the psukim in the Torah, the pasuk says, "Aseh ta'aseh es kol tevuas zaracha hayotze soda shana shana." One should surely give Maa'ser. This is a pasuk in Devarim, in the 14th chapter of Devarim. And the pasuk says, pasuk 22, and the pasuk says that every farmer should tithe the crops that grow in one's fields. Now, is this only a mitzvah for crops, or does this also apply to other forms of profit that are made? Now, there's no doubt that in Pshuto Shel Mikra, we know that Torah can be read on multiple levels. In Pshuto Shel Mikra, in the simplest understanding of the Pesukim, this is O mitzvah only on agricultural produce. And that's very clear in the language of the Pesukim. However, on a drush level, maybe just I'll explain very briefly how Chazal understood Torah as working. So Chazal understood Torah as working in such that Torah can be read on multiple levels. And each level has its own sort of operating mechanics of how it works. Now, one level of reading Torah is Peshat. Peshat is perhaps most similar to how we would read a text naturally. You just read the text and try and understand what the text is saying. Now, of course, it has to be read with great care. If you read a great novelist or a great writer, you ponder the text at length. Why do they use this particular language? Why do they use this metaphor? What's the point they're trying to convey? Why do they structure the story in a particular manner? Why do they tell you this detail and miss out another detail? Why is this character important? Why is that incident missed out? So Peshat is a very profound level of learning, but basically it's just trying to understand the text in a sense, in a readable literary manner. This is one level of interpreting the Torah. Chazal, however, interpreted it on numerous other levels. There's perhaps we can call it a Kabbalistic or a very spiritual level in which it's read, in which the Torah is understood to be referring to profound either philosophical or Kabbalistic ideas, and we refer to that reading a Sod, the secrets of Torah. They read it on a Remez level, and for the purposes of our discussion, they also read it on a Drush level, on a Drushus level. Now, the word Drush or Drosha means to seek out layers of meaning. For example, the pasuk says that if one finds a lost object, one should look after it for the loser. Ad derosh achicha, till your brother, your fellow, seeks it out. So the word derosh means to seek out. When a Rav gives a sermon, we refer to it as a drosha for two reasons. Number one, because in general, what will be shared will be a deeper layer of meaning rather than the simplest reading, the Pshuto Shel Mikra. And secondly, because a drosha is a sermon, it's demanding of people, improve. It has a message to it, a content to it, and therefore that's referred to as drush. Medrash, of course, is the same root word, medrash from the word drush. Now, sometimes when we read the droshos, the interpretations of Chazal, we understand what they're doing. We see how they're uncovering a deeper layer in the text. Sometimes the drush doesn't behave in a manner that we would think of as how normal texts work. So, for example, an example of a type of drosha of Chazal is what's called a gezerah shava. A gezerah shava is identical use of words, meaning to say that if you have a word in one section of halachas in the Torah, and you have the same words in another section of halachas, it acts as a type of, we call it nowadays a hyperlink, and it sort of acts as a bridge between these two areas of halacha, transferring halachas from one section to the other section. This is called a gezerah shava. And this doesn't obey any normal literary rule. It's not Pshuto Shel Mikra, it's a gezerah shava. The best analogy I have to explain how this works is something like computer code. So imagine I am a brilliant computer coder, such that I can write computer code. I'm so skilled and talented in writing this code that I'm able to style it in a manner that a non-programmer can read it and think they're just reading a basic text. So I don't know much about computer programming, but I remember my basic computer programming from when I did GCSE. And, if it says line 10, print hello, line 20, go to here, or whatever, you could imagine someone reading it who knows nothing about computer programming, who reads it as 10 print hello. That's interesting, 10 people print hello, 20 go to wherever, 20 people, you can imagine someone who doesn't understand programming just reading it as a story. So Chazal seems to have understood the Torah something like that it's read on many levels, but for the purpose of our discussion, two levels. One level in which it can just be read as a story and a narrative or a set of instructions, and that's Peshat. And a second level in which it doesn't behave in line with a normal literary text, but it behaves as a piece of computer programming with its own particular instructions to it. Now, imagine if I'm such a brilliant computer programmer that I can write this program such that it can be read as a narrative, and it can operate in one programming language, making one thing happen, and in another programming language, making a separate thing happen. And imagine that these three levels all link up. So maybe in the simple reading of it as a text, as a narrative, it tells me that Jack and Jill went up the hill, two people went up a hill. On a programming language level 1, it makes a little figurine, 2 little figurines walk up a hill. And on programming level 2, it makes dramatic music, dum, 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 as they're walking up the hill, and then, crashing sounds as they fall down the hill again, or whatever it may be. So I've written with one piece of coding something that contains multiple layers of meaning. It can be read just as a story, it can create these little stick figures walking up the hill, and it can create dramatic music around it. And they all line up in some sense and all enrich and complement each other on the level of reading. This is how Chazal understood Torah. That's what they mean when they talk about Torah having multiple layers. And understood that there's a pshuto shel mikra, there's reading Torah as if it's regular literature, and then there's reading Torah as if it behaves as a computer program of sorts. Things like Gezerah Shavah, it doesn't make any literary sense, but it acts as a hyperlink, as I said, to transfer halachas, and then also the mystical secrets, which is another level, and so on and so forth. This is how they understood the text of Torah. Now, not all these different layers have halachic application. So, for example, Soid and Ramez will generally not affect practical halacha, whereas Drush will. So, practical halachas are derived from the Pshutei Shel Mikra, the instructions the Pesukim says, and from the Drushas, the Drush, the sort of extra layer of meaning which Chazal understood. And the rules of this extra layer of meaning are summarized in the paragraph that we traditionally read just before Pesukid. Zimmer Rabbi Shmuel Omer b'Shlosh Esrei Midos. There's Shlosh Esrei Midot, 13. It's one of these words that you only ever hear in the context of a sort of discussion around like hermeneutical principles. I don't know exactly what the word hermeneutical principle means. It means 13 principles of deriving deeper meaning from language. That's what this idea is. And there's various other rules that apply. Now, why are we talking about this? Because there is a posuk that says, as I mentioned in Devarim, Aser to Aser, you should surely tithe as kol tevruas zaracha, all the produce of the agricultural produce, hayotze hasada, that comes out of the fields, shana shana, year by year. Now, in a pashat level, that simply means tithe agricultural produce, and that is the simplest understanding of the halacha. However, there are those who pick up on the nuance of the language, and they say, what does it mean you should surely tithe all the produce of your field? Kol tevuat zaracha, all the produce of the field. Just say you should tithe the produce of the field, and that means all of it. What's this addition of all of the produce of the field? And they use that to teach that even things beyond the produce of the field should be tithed. In other words, when the pasuk says, the real way to read the pasuk in the drush level is, you should tithe everything like you tithe the produce of the field. So it almost puts a comma there. Aser to aser is kol, you should tithe everything. For example, tevuat hasada, like the agricultural produce of the field. So there is a school of thought, the thought of Tosfos, who is of the belief that the obligation to tithe all income that we have is a Torah obligation based upon this nuance of language in the pasuk. Incidentally, the first phrase in the pasuk also has a drush or midrashic reading to it. Aser to aser, you should surely tithe. Now, the Medrash picks up on this language, you should surely tithe, aser to aser. So why don't you use this double expression, aser to aser? Just say, to aser, to take Maa'ser on the Tzedaka. What's aser to aser? And the Medrash derives from that, aser, take Maa'ser, to aser, and through that you will take more Maa'ser. In other words, you will become enriched through taking Maa'ser, which is the idea that we mentioned before, that the Medrash says that as a reward for tithing one's money, one will have the money returned to one. We explained that Maa'ser, tithing, means you're taking Hashem as a partner. Hashem is a pretty good business partner to have in your financial affairs. If you bring Hashem in as a partner, you will flourish, you will do well. So again, in that context, it's a medrash in the sense that it doesn't have a practical halachic ramification. It's just telling us that there is a reward, extraordinary reward for tithing one's produce or one's money. But the second nuance of the pasuk, kol, in the midrashic reading, in the drush reading, means tithe everything, comma, in the manner in which one tithes the agricultural produce. So according to one opinion, in the same way as there's a Torah obligation on farmers in the lands of Israel to tithe their fields, there's an obligation on everyone to tithe their income. This is one source for the concept of Maa'ser. This is not the mainstream view. The majority of halachic sources do not think that tithing is a Torah obligation, and they think it is either rabbinic or a minhag. Now, I just want to explain what this means. In a few moments, I'm going to demonstrate that it is certainly a Torah value, but whether it is a halachic requirement, this is what we're discussing over here. As a halachic value, absolutely. We find it in the dawn of Jewish history was this concept of tithing a tenth of what one had in order to give it to charity. Anyone remembers any examples where tithing takes place very early in Jewish history? We're with Avram, it's superb. Avram is granted the loot of the, without going through the whole story, there's this encounter between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and Avram steps to the rescue, and he conquers the wealth of the 4 kings. And the king of Sodom comes to Avram, and Avram says, I'm going to give you everything back, but before I do that, I'm going to take Maa'ser, I'm going to take a tithe, a tenth, and give it to Tzedaka. Why does Avram take a tithing? Because he says, I wish to return to the king of Sodom the loot. I don't want to profit from him. But before I do that, the fact is it's become my property. It's been captured in war. It's legitimate spoil. I'm going to tithe it before I give it back. So we find Avram taking tithing. And the Medrash also identifies a story where Yitzchak takes tithes, which I'm not going to go into. And again, we have another example, though, in early history of someone who takes tithes. Sorry? Even earlier than that, Ruth we find not that she takes tithe, but she's a recipient of a certain type of charity, which is an explicit possible because it's an agricultural charity, which is sheaves which have been left behind and so on and so forth. We find Yaakov promising to tithe if God stays with him. So after Yaakov has his encounter with the mystical experience of the dream of the ladder, he turns to Hashem and he says, if you're with me and I get back safely, and with possessions, any possessions I've managed to achieve, which we know he does go on and achieve, he flourishes in Lavan's house and he creates great wealth. When he comes back, he takes all of that as Maa'ser, he tithes that also. So tithing is definitely a Torah value, and we see it entering in the halachic system with agricultural tithes. But according to most opinions, this is the tithing of all finance is not a Torah obligation. So what is it? According to some, it is a rabbinic obligation, it's a drabanon. And according to others, it is a minhag, it is a custom, an appropriate practice, but not even a rabbinic obligation. Now, I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the word minhag, because minhag, which we think of as custom, is a little bit of a confusing word. And it's used for many different things. And I'm not going to go now into the whole topic of what a minhag is, other than to say that you need to be cautious whenever you meet the word minhag and have some clarity as to what does it mean. So minhag can mean custom in the sense of cultural custom. You know, we have a minhag to use braided challahs on Friday night. There's no halachic requirement to have that. Maybe there's some symbolic significance to it, or maybe not even that. Maybe it's just what Jews got used to doing. Maybe they picked it up from their surroundings and it became a Jewish custom. It wasn't originally a Jewish custom, maybe it was, but we do it because tradition is an important thing to do. It's a way of keeping connected to the past. It's a way of giving children a sense of familiarity. You know, you feel Shabbos coming in when you have uniquely shaped bread. It's definitely a beautiful thing to do. It makes the bread of Shabbos different to the bread of the rest of the week because it's shaped differently. There's no halachic requirement. It's just a custom. You know, we have a custom. Many people will have a white tablecloth on the table on Friday night. There's no halachic obligation to do so. It's just, this is what gives a sense of Shabbos experience. It's a nice thing to do, but nothing more than that. So sometimes customs are just that. They're just a cultural tradition, but that has value because cultural traditions have values and they allow us to feel a sense of relationship to deeper things like our community and our history and Shabbos. Sometimes customs have some deeper halachic or midrashic significance. An example of that is, for example, eating milk on Shavuos, having a milky meal on Shavuos. So this dates back to a midrashim that talk about milk having a particular association with Shavuos. We're not going to go into the reasons now, but it makes it into Shulchan Aruch in the sense that it's brought by the classic poskim, and therefore it's a minhag that has some weighting to it. If you choose not to have milk on Shavuos, what aveira have you done? Done any transgression? There's no halacha that you have to, but it is a minhag which is more than just a cultural tradition. It's something that has some halachic weight around it. There's no pasuk or halacha or laws or rabbanon, Torah law that one's violated. It's a minhag. And then you have minhagim that achieve semi or complete halachic status. And in a sense, these are type of drabbanons. They have a genuine rabbinic significance. And the Rambam and others explain that there were pieces of rabbinic legislation that were top down. In other words, the Rabbonim decreed this as a piece of rabbinic legislation. And there are other pieces of human enhancement or addition to halachic practice, which were bottom up. They arose from what communities did, and communities accepted this upon themselves as an appropriate halachic practice, demonstrating an appropriate sensitivity to halacha, and therefore this has become treated or achieved the significance of a type of drabonon. Examples of this, for example, are some of the morning practices that we keep during the Omer, or some of the morning practices that we keep during the 3 weeks and parts of the 9 days. There's no, as far as we are aware, there's no specific legislation that was made around this, but this was accepted, this became accepted by the Jewish people as practice, and therefore is treated with the full significance of rabbinic authority. So these are 3 ways in which the word minhag is used. Yes. Kinyot would be another example of this. Probably. Again, it may be there was specific legislation made and maybe not, but certainly it has the status of a drabanon because of that. Yes. Excellent. Finally, there's a 4th use of the word minhag, which actually really means a type of halachic decision-making process. So very briefly, it's no news to any of you that there is much machlokas and disagreement in halacha over how we paskin. There will be debates between different figures of significance in the halachic system, and we need to rule and decide between these opinions. And sometimes the ruling is based on well-known halachic rules, like following the majority opinion, or perhaps one argument is more convincing than another argument. And occasionally, a disagreement will emerge in which the practice of one community is to paskin like view A, and the practice of another community is to paskin like view B. In this instance, even though we refer to it as a minhag, and maybe you'll say, oh, you're Sephardi, you're Ashkenazi, so Sephardim do this, and Ashkenazim do that. In truth, the minhag is merely a means to determine how we are ruling, how we are paskening in an argument. So the minhag could affect things which are of Torah significance. There may be an argument between Sephardi and Ashkenazi poskim about warming up, reheating water on Shabbos, and there could be a potential for a Torah distinction for one person. It's an argument about what's included in the Torah law of lo ta'aseh malacha, don't do malacha on Shabbos. So it's a fundamental Torah debate, but we have to decide how we rule. And it may be that Sephardim adopt one ruling and Ashkenazim adopt another ruling in it. Now, fundamentally, all the word minhag means is a expression of a different system of pasak within the 2 or many communities. So whenever you hear the word minhag, I'm afraid it's one of these messy words that means too many things, and it needs unpicking what exactly we mean by this terminology. To summarize, though, if we zoom back in from a sort of big exploration of halacha and history and everything else, what we've said is as follows. There is a pasuk that tells us there is a mitzvah to tithe agricultural projects. It's a very ancient practice in our family, in the Semitic history, even before the giving of the Torah. We find the Avos, Avraham and Yaakov, and perhaps even Yitzchak, engaged in tithing. It's certainly a good thing to do. But what is the source of the chiyuv, the obligation to do so? Minority opinion, but a significant one, the opinion of Tosfos, that it is a Torah obligation derived from a nuance of language. Kol, tithe everything, which they understand to mean to tithe all income, not just agricultural produce. And the majority opinion is that this is not a genuine Torah obligation. This is a rabbinic obligation, either through a specific piece of legislation or a minhag, in the sense of something that one ought to do, but not with the full halachic, not with a full halachic requirement, not with full halachic weight. Now, more or less, the opinion that says that it is a Torah obligation doesn't really enter into the practical halachic significance, halachic system, beyond being a chumrah. In other words, someone who wishes to be stringent upon themselves, someone who wishes to engage in mitzvahs in the highest and most profound and beautiful level, will treat this mitzvah with the stringencies of Torah law. But in general, most poskim are of the belief that the core halacha is that it is not a Torah obligation. Now, there are distinctions, nafkaminas, differences between whether you view it as a Torah obligation or a rabbinic obligation, because if it is a Torah obligation, it behaves in an analogous manner, perhaps, to the obligation to tithe crops. Now, the halacha is that a crop which is untithed, one isn't allowed to eat it. One isn't allowed to benefit from it, or at least eat it, rather, until it is tithed, until the tithes have been taken. So in England, you can walk into a supermarket and just eat an apple, and you have to pay for it, buy an apple and eat it without any need for a hechsher. In Israel, apples grown in Israel, you can't just go into a supermarket anywhere and buy it. You have to check the supermarket has a hechsher, and that it's been tithed. Now you may say, why is it my problem if it hasn't been tithed? It's the farmer's problem. The farmer had the mitzvah to tithe, and that's correct. But now that I've got the apple, it is tevel, it is forbidden to eat until it's tithed. It's a type of non-kosher food until trumas and maasers are taken. Therefore, you need to check when you buy fruit in Israel that it has an appropriate hechsher. So it is possible that if we compare agricultural tithing to all monetary tithing, again, none of us are farmers here, but we all hopefully earn some money, have some income, and if we have to tithe the income, if that's parallel or analogous to the farming comparison, it is possible that we're not allowed to use the money till we tithe. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to explain that we don't rule like this. We rule that you can earn money, and every so often you do an accounting and work out how much charity you have to give. However, according to the strictest opinion, that is the Torah law, it may be that's not enough. It may be that as soon as you get money, you need to tithe it, otherwise you're not allowed to use the money. Now, I want to emphasize again that we do not paskin like this as far as Kol Halacha is concerned. Kol Halacha says it is legitimate to every so often do an accounting, and even if you haven't taken Maa'ser, the money is not forbidden to be used. Going forward, you should start taking Maa'ser if you're obligated in Maa'ser, but you don't have to take it. So this is distinction number one. Nafkamina number one is, do you have to tithe immediately or not? Distinction number two is, after you tithe, how quickly do you have to give the money away? Now, with agricultural tithing, without going through all the details, there is a time limit by which point you have given the tithes to the due recipients of the tithing. And I'll just explain very briefly how this works. In the halachic system, there is a 7-year cycle with which we are familiar, because every 7th year is a Shemitah. But the 6 intervening years have the halachas of tithing, and they're split into 2 groups of 3. So there's years 1, 2, 3, and then years 4, 5, 6. And at the end of each group of 3 years, you have to biarti hakodesh min habayis. You have to have emptied the house out of any tithes. So a farmer, as soon as they farm and collect in the grain and pile it up and so on, they're meant to tithe. Only then can they benefit from the grain. And now they have a separate storehouse with all the Maa'ser and Truma grains. When do they have to give this? Ideally, you should give it to a Kohen and Levi immediately, but at worst, at the end of every 3-year block, you have to ensure it's been given away. So by analogy, there would be some form of time limit by which you have to actually give your money to Tzedaka. Again, most poskim do not think this is correct. And whilst they say it's good practice to make sure you give your Maa'ser money away, and certainly if there's a recipient in front of you collecting money, you need to give your Maa'ser away, but they don't think that there's a need to make sure there's no specific time period allocated in halachot when one has to give the money away. So again, just to summarize, it is possible, minority view, that we should think of tithing money like tithing agricultural product. If we follow that model, it's possible, number one, that you shouldn't use the money till it's tithed, and it's possible, number two, that there's a time limit for distributing the money. Finally, in this model, it would seem that this is irrespective of whether you are wealthy or poor. A farmer has to tithe his agricultural produce, even if he is poor, and even if this will tip him into poverty. So he may need to be recipient of other charitable funds, but he still has to tithe his produce because the produce demands tithing. So in this model, it may be that even someone who struggles to earn their own living has to tithe their income because all money needs to be tithed like an agricultural produce. So these are 3 halachic outcomes of the most stringent model that views Maa'ser as a Torah obligation. As I've said already, this is not the mainstream Pesach. We do not take these 3 stringencies on board. There are individuals who, on a voluntary basis, do behave in this stringent manner because they want to fulfill the mitzvah, even according to the most stringent and Mahadrin or Machmir variant. Yes? It's a good question, and I don't entirely know the answer. The agricultural tithing is only in Israel. It seems that the Drush reading is saying you have to tithe everything, Like you have to tithe agricultural produce in Israel. That's how they break up the pasuk. I've often wondered about this question, but that would appear to be how they understand it. The pasuk says you have to tithe everything. Everything is not a mitzvah that's toluyos ba'oretz, that's dependent on the land of Israel, because business and income is not a land-based produce, and therefore it's not linked to Israel, and therefore they understood that it's not an Israel-based mitzvah. Whereas agricultural produce emerges from the hayotze hasoda that comes out of the field, and therefore agricultural products are only in the lands of Israel. That would appear to be how they understand Halacha. Okay, so henceforth we are going to work with the assumption that Maa'ser is a maximum rabbinic obligation and minimum a halachic minhag, not just a minhag like braided challahs, a minhag that has halachic weight, but nonetheless not an absolute obligation. That's how we're going to understand tithing, the obligation of Maa'ser going forth. Even though, as I've mentioned, there is an opinion that takes the view that this is a Torah obligation with resultant stringencies in how it needs to be applied. Even a poor person has to take it. You have to tithe immediately, and you have to make sure that it's given out within a short space of time. That's a minority opinion. We're going to go with the majority opinion that tithing is appropriate to do, good to do, perhaps a rabbinic obligation, perhaps a custom, but certainly something that every Jew should do, but not an absolute requirement. Again, I want to stress, as I said at the beginning, Tzedaka, everyone agrees is an obligation. It's a Torah obligation. It's explicit psukim, as we said at the beginning. That's not the debate. Giving to a poor person who approaches you, obligation. We're here talking about you have to tithe and calculate and give a tenth. That's where this discussion is. What we're learning today is not the halachas of Tzedaka. Tzedaka is definitely an obligation. What we're learning is the halachas of Maa'ser, and Maa'ser may not be a Torah obligation. It may be a rabbinic obligation. At the end of the day, however, we have to take Maa'ser. So that's not the debate over here. We do have to take Maa'ser. The question is it rabbinic or Torah obligation or halacha that emerges from common practice? There is another halacha floating around here. And I just want to again give a little bit of background to this halacha. There is a sequence of psukim in the Torah that tells us that we humans can take on ourselves obligations, and these obligations can become Torah obligations. And this is what's known as a neder, promise, a commitment. If you make a promise to do something or specify an object and dedicate it to a particular purpose, like this sum of money is donated to the shul, or this animal should be a korban, a sacrifice, without going through the details of exactly how this works, one's verbal acceptance of an obligation achieves a force of law, and if I break my commitment, I'm in breach of my word. Lo yachel dvoro. A person shouldn't make chol, shouldn't empty. We talk about hamadl ben kodesh chol, like between that which is sacred, kodesh, and chol, that which is secular. The etymology of the word chol, secular, is empty, like halal is a vacuum. So Kedusha fills things with spirituality. Something which is chol, it's not bad, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a vacuum. It doesn't have this extra dimension of sanctity pumped into it. Says the pasuk, in modern Hebrew, halal is a vacuum, literally outer space is called a halal. In classical Hebrew, halal is an empty space. So lo yachel dvoro, a person shouldn't make their dibur, their words chol. They shouldn't empty their words of meaning. They shouldn't make their words secular or profane. Words have significance. So a neder has a halachic weight to it. Now, there is, again, I'm not going to go through all the details, but there's significant halachic discussion about two extensions of the concept of neder. The first extension is, if you adopt a good practice and take it upon oneself to do, that may achieve a force of a neder, because I sort of accepted it upon myself to do. Now, if I take Maa'ser as a habit, and I've accepted it upon myself to do such a good deed, it could, in many circumstances, achieve the status of a neder, commitment, and if I'm bound by it, like I'm bound by any promise or commitment I make. So even if the obligation of Maa'ser starts off life as a minhag or a drabanon, it may in a sense achieve greater significance as an absolute obligation, because I've accepted this upon myself as a mitzvah, as a requirement. Then there's further discussion as to whether a community can accept upon itself a communal obligation with the force of neder, and indeed can this commitment affect future generations, one's descendants. Let me just try and give a metaphor to help understand what that means. all of us sitting here in this room are individuals. We individuals own things. We have property, we own a pen or money or whatever it may be. We, in halachic sense, can make a neder for ourselves. That's what it means to have individual existence and behave as a legal entity as an individual. However, we also understand that there's something like a corporate identity of sorts. So if a company takes upon itself a loan, the company has to pay the loan back. If a country takes upon itself a loan, the country, the nation, has to pay the loan back. So if Britain took on a loan 150 years ago, it's still obligated to pay that loan back, even though there may be no citizen in Britain alive today who was alive when the loan was taken on. If a country has ethical or moral guilt and accepts reparation payments, Germany took upon itself to pay compensation to victims of the Holocaust and so on, that obligation remains as long as there are recipients for it, even if there's no citizen in Germany alive at still alive. The country has a corporate identity responsibility. If a company takes upon itself an obligation to provide the service, British Telecom agrees to provide phone line to you, and 5-10 years on, there's not a single employee of British Telecom left who took it on. It doesn't matter. There's a corporate identity of sorts. So there's a lot of debate in halacha about exactly how to apply halacha to corporate identities in that sense. But it may well be that communities or families have some form of corporate identity, which means that the community accepts upon itself certain obligations, which then become a communal obligation and commitment, and in a sense take on the force of a neder, of a promise that's been made. In other words, it's possible that a community can bind itself on a communal level to a certain type of behavior, and anyone who continues to identify with that community is bound by that commitment. And you mentioned kitnius before. That may be an example of such a thing. So kitnius may be something that at least Ashkenazi Jewry took upon itself on a corporate level, and therefore we are bound by that halachic commitment. So the second thing to bear in mind when it comes to Maa'ser is that it is possible that either individually or on a collective basis we have taken this on as a form of collective neder, collective promise, and therefore we are bound by lo yachal devar, a person should keep their commitments and not be in breach of their commitments. The advice the poskim give is that when one starts taking Maa'ser, it is probably worthwhile to specify that I'm not taking this on as a commitment, I'm not making this into a neder, into a promise to keep it. And that way one avoids halachic complication if life circumstances change and one is unable to continue to afford Maa'ser because one has become poorer, or for some reason one messes up one's accounting and things become unclear as to how much money I need to give to Tzedaka. They advise accepting the obligation of Maa'ser as beli neder, as without commitment, and that avoids getting into this extra strands of complication. So just to summarize what we're saying now, we're saying that there's debate as to what the real or core obligation of Maa'ser is. Is it Torah obligation, rabbinic obligation, minhag? And then there's a second tier to this, which is even if in essence it's not a core obligation, if I've taken it on myself as a practice, or perhaps communally we've taken it on as a practice, maybe then it achieves the force of an aid and therefore has the significance of practice. And the general advice that the post can give is, as one starts taking Maa'ser, as you enter into sort of the stage in life where you have an income, don't accept it as a practice. Specify that I don't want to accept it as an neder, and that way one has increased flexibility. It also gives one a little bit more autonomy in specifying what one's going to use the Maa'ser for if you do this. So there's a lot of discussion, and maybe we'll go into it into a little bit in future weeks. What charity can I give my Maa'ser money to? And there's a range of opinions around the topic. Is it only to impoverished people, or is it to other worthy causes? I mean, there's many worthy causes out there that don't involve impoverished people. Maybe it's ill health, maybe it's learning, Torah learning, maybe it's research into cures for diseases. There could be a bunch of education. There could be all sorts of worthy causes that aren't impoverished recipients. Now, again, how narrow is the obligation of Maa'ser isn't entirely clear, and therefore this is another advantage in specifying when you take on Maa'ser that I'm not doing this as an obligation, and therefore I'm not bound by the narrowest definition of where Maa'ser should be given. Now, one of the senior poskim of the last generation of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach points out that our practice initially in the Ashkenazi world, and this has spread to many other parts of the Jewish world, is every Yom Kippur Eve to announce that we are not accepting any Nedorim on ourselves this year, unless we specify to the contrary. Kol Nidre, right? Kol Nidre, right? We stand on Kippur, and we chant Kol Nidre. And one of the things that we say in Kol Nidre, and we also say in Hataras Nedorim of Erev Rosh Hashanah, is that everything we do is accepted b'li neder, and we don't want our good practices to take on the force of law, of the force of commitment. Now, again, this is way beyond the scope of our shir to what degree this declaration is effective or not. Hashem Zalman was of the belief that we don't need to assume that our Maa'ser obligations have taken on the force of commitment because we've declared Kol Nidre previously. So just to summarize this part of the shir, the outcome that we are going to emerge with as we go forward in future weeks is that Maa'ser should be given. It should be viewed as an obligation, but nonetheless, it shouldn't be viewed as an obligation that has the full force of Torah obligation, because the core idea that it's Torah obligation is a minority opinion, and the idea that it has taken on the force of a neder for various reasons doesn't appear to be categorically clear and obvious, and therefore we're not going to take the most stringent view of Maa'ser. We're going to take the broader definition of Maa'ser, because the sort of halachic consensus, we don't need to treat it in the strictest way, but nonetheless there is an obligation of Maa'ser, and it's something that we need to learn. What we're going to speak about in the next week's shir, will be who is obligated to Maa'ser. I touched on this when I spoke in the Maa'ser event. How well off does one have to be obligated in Maa'ser? What is the best practical system to ensure that you're taking Maa'ser? How practically speaking should one set up one's accounting to take Maa'ser? What are the appropriate recipients of Maa'ser? And these will be hopefully next week, and the week after that we'll conclude the subject of Maa'ser. This is what we're going to speak about for now. But for this week, the introductory shir, we've run out of time. I'll simply say, as I said, what we've discussed this week is what is the source of the obligation of Maa'ser. We've seen it goes back to the dawn of Jewish history, Avram and Yaakov and perhaps Yitzchak, and therefore certainly is a very important thing to do. So we'll stop there for today. Okay. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining. That's it. Thank you.